Thank you, worship team, for leading us in praise this morning. So we're finishing up the sermon series about good work today, and it would not be a complete picture of a theology on work if we didn't talk about rest. This is probably the one I think, at least I know in my household, the household I grew up in, probably a lot of yours, you don't do so well at. You probably wonder how you can rest. That's probably the question you have is like, how am I supposed to rest when we've got kids that are wearing us out, we have our work, and we've got sports going on. How in the world can we rest? Is that even an option? I don't know right now because I'm in that stage. It's a biblical principle, and we're going to talk about why it's God's design, and we should be doing it. It is something we should actually try to make a priority, but before I give this sermon, I want you to know that probably more than anything in preparing for this sermon and even what I say today, it's probably more for me than anybody else because I struggle at it. I just do. It's so easy to wear myself out to the point of burnout. It seems like that's way more likely that I would work myself towards burnout than laziness. So I say that as just a warning ahead of time that it's more for me, I think it seems like. At least that's what it seems like God's been doing in my heart preparing for this. So I hope you're prepared as well. So we have lots of 6th, 7th graders in here. You guys are going to enjoy this first story that I have for you. So the question I have, and this should be in the handout you have as well. I'll move this out of my way. Have you ever been so... You don't need to raise your hands because maybe you won't. Have you ever been so tired that you fell asleep at work? Is anyone willing to admit that? Okay, we got a couple. All right. So, have you guys ever seen videos where usually guys mess with other guys when they're asleep? Yeah, that happens. So I want to give you a little bit of story. I won't say his name because some of you know who he is. He does not go to church here, but he is a local guy. He's my buddy. We worked at, it was Mansfield Motor Group at the time, the Honda dealership. We were young guys, so staying up till late at night, playing video games or whatever it was we were doing. Sometimes we would shoot bottle rockets at each other. So we were always up to something. And typically that meant that we would be tired at work. And at that age, I'll be honest with you, there was lots of caffeine, lots and lots of caffeine. Monster energy drinks were kind of just coming around, and Red Bulls and that kind of stuff. And this is not good. I'm not recommending this. Actually, it probably did damage to our hearts. But that's what kept us awake. Now, my job, I didn't, even if I felt really tired, I couldn't really fall asleep because I was a customer service person. And typically my whole day was booked up. Like every half hour I had somebody coming in. So I didn't have the chance to fall asleep even if I was tired. My buddy, on the other hand, he was the shuttle driver. So what that meant is if we had a customer that needed a ride to work or needed a ride back home because their car's getting worked on, we would then call him and say, hey, you've got a customer. So he wasn't always real busy. And on those days where we stayed up late doing whatever it was we were doing, he was kind of known to fall asleep at work. So being that we worked in a garage and had lots of resources available, his favorite place to fall asleep was the bathroom. And we knew it, but it was kind of hidden away and people didn't know if he was in there asleep. But there was a timer on the lights, and if we saw him go in there and the lights went off, we knew he had been in there long enough that the timer went off. He's probably asleep. So me and my boss had the great idea that we would try to do a prank on him. And I was a pyrotechnic, so we found a lighter and some brake cleaner, not brake fluid. And if you light a lighter and spray brake cleaner across it, it's like a flamethrower. So we had the bright idea that this day he went into the bathroom, the lights went off, we knew he's asleep, so we cracked the door open just enough that we can kind of get the flame to go underneath the stall door and into where he's at. So I remember we were being real quiet, and then we opened the door, and I lit the lighter, sprayed the brake cleaner, and then all you heard was the loudest pitched scream that you could ever hear because he had woken up to flames coming underneath the stall door. But that's the kind of stuff that we did because he was so tired he fell asleep at work. And some of you have admitted to falling asleep at work. Obviously, it's not something we're probably proud of, but it's happened before. But why is that? Why do we push ourselves to the point where we're so tired that even when we're at our work and we're getting paid to do work, that we fall asleep? I'm not throwing judgment out there. It happens. We know we shouldn't be doing it. But have you ever been that tired that you've fallen asleep at work? Obviously, that is a point of tired that we probably shouldn't approach. We need to be getting enough rest so that we're not falling asleep, so you don't fall asleep in a stall and get a flamethrower underneath the door at you. All right, let's go. We're going to start all the way in Genesis, okay? I guess if you're looking at me, start at Genesis. We're going to look at the Old Testament. You're going to see it take place in the creation story. We've heard the story. God created everything in 6 days. On the seventh day, He rested. That's kind of the first instance where we see that rest was a godly principle. And then we go into Exodus, and we're going to see a command where God actually commands us to take a Sabbath. And then we're going to work into the New Testament and see some of the principles there. Did you know that the Sabbath was in the Ten Commandments, but that Sabbath is not reiterated in the New Testament? So we're going to look at some of the reasons of that. Jesus actually addresses that. So go to Genesis chapter 2. That's where we're going to be first, and we're going to see kind of what God's rhythm, God's principle that He kind of put in place that we can model our lives after as well. And again, this is something that we probably most of us fail at, including me, that's for sure. So let's listen to what God's Word has to say to us all about it. Let's go to Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 first. This is the creation story. It says, on the seventh day, God completed His work that He had done, and then He rested on that seventh day. So you're probably already wondering, is this Sunday? Is this Saturday? I don't think that's necessarily the important part. But in this case, let's say He started work on Monday, and He worked Monday through Saturday. Let's say Sunday is that Sabbath day. He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He'd done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy. It says, for on it He rested from all His work of creation. So here's the creation story. Things were perfect at this point. God had made the garden, and He's made everything, including the humans. And He's given, at this point, He's rested. But then also we see that Adam was made to work. Adam was made to tend to the garden, to tend to the animals. He was put there for a reason, and part of that reason was to work. But God modeled this. He says, I worked for 6 days. I completed all this stuff, way more than we could ever create. He did everything in 6 days and then took a break and said, it's all good. My work is good. Now I'm going to rest. Here's where we sometimes get mistaken, is that we think the fact that we have to go to work is because of a result of sin. We think that because sin entered the world, now we have to toil and we go through things and we have to work hard. And there's some truth to that we do have to work harder because of it. Even farmers have to work harder. They have to keep out the weeds and the animals that eat things. And you have to work hard as a farmer to make sure that your work is protected. But Adam was working before the fall. Before they actually took of the fruit or took of the tree of knowledge, they were working. So the fact that we work is not a result of sin. It's always been a part of what we were going to do here on earth. The difference, though, is that sin did enter the world, and now it's part of our struggle. It's part of what we do to survive, really. Now, as technology has advanced, we've gone a long ways in making things a little bit easier. The industrialization of farming and agriculture has played a part in that, probably to the detriment of our own health because of the chemicals and things that we've come up with to make it easier. But the point is, it's become a little bit easier because of the technology, the equipment, the chemicals, that kind of stuff. But here's what I really want to get and want you to understand is I don't want you to have the perspective that when you go to work on a Monday morning, I know some of you work weird shifts, but when you go to work, it's not just because of the result of sin. Okay, it's actually an opportunity, and we've already discussed this in prior weeks, it's an opportunity for worship as well. Everything that you do, everything you put your hand to can be an act of worship if you have your heart set in the right place. Let's go to Exodus chapter 16 is where we'll be at. Exodus chapter 16. Kind of give you a timeline. Creation. God created everything in 6 days, rested on the seventh. Adam was also a part of the work in the garden before sin entered the world. Then sin entered. He was still working, but much more hard. And then we get to Exodus, and if you remember Exodus, God's people they were put into slavery at one point, and when they were put into slavery, they were not allowed to practice the Sabbath. Basically, this type of slavery that they were in was one where they would just push you to the limit. They would push you to the point where you were working every day, your body was being pushed so far that it was just no longer able to do anything else. That was not God's design. Even those who still worshiped God were forced to be put into a work situation that's not what God wanted. He wanted them to work hard for 6 days, but then also wanted them to take a break from their work. So while they're in slavery, they weren't able to do that. God delivered them from slavery. And God is trying to free them and put them into the promised land. We're going to read a little bit more about this. But just know that the Sabbath itself was a part of the reason that God was delivering them from slavery, Moses and all of God's people. So let's read Exodus chapter 16. We're going to go from verse 22 to 30, so we got several verses to read here. But this kind of gives us a better picture of what was going on. It says, on the 6th day they gathered twice as much food, 4 quarts apiece, and all the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. And he told them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake, boil what you want to boil, and set aside everything left over to be kept until morning. So they set it aside until morning as Moses commanded, and it didn't stink or have maggots in it. That's important because part of the reason that working the day of and kind of eating what you gathered that day was to prevent that overnight issue where the things would go bad. How many of you are comfortable with eating food that sat on the counter overnight? Some of you are. Jeremiah, look at you. I mean, it's fine, right? Do you have maggots in the food? No maggots? All right. Well, I'm glad. When your food is outside, when your food is in the wilderness where you are, there's probably a better chance that you would have maggots and your food would stink because no matter what the weather is, your food is just, one, it's fresh food. It's not processed like we eat a lot of times. Nature does its thing. So when they says that they baked everything, they boiled everything, they gathered all this food on the day before they're supposed to rest, and then it didn't stink or have maggots in it, that is actually a miracle in itself that God said if you work hard for the 6 days, prepare for that Sabbath rest, He would take care of it for you. So that's a minor detail that we could skip right over, but that's a miracle. The fact that food didn't stink and didn't have maggots in it. He says, eat it today, Moses says, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord, and today you won't find any in the field. This is another interesting part. Even if they were going to go gather food, Moses is saying, if you try, there's not going to be any today. which means God is in control of what they were able to gather. You know, as hunter-gatherers or people who like to hunt, if you're a good hunter, maybe you've learned how to like track deer down, and well, you probably have trail cams and corn set out as well. But you learn patterns. If you're a good hunter, you know how to find food. But the food that they were eating, they didn't have corn to set out. They didn't have trail cams to figure out where the food was. God's saying, if you would have went out there, I would not have provided food for you because you were supposed to be resting. I provided everything you needed on those 6 days, and you were supposed to rest. And he says, because of this, he says, for 6 days you'll gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none. Yet on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they didn't find any. Some people, which obviously there's always some people went out to gather, they didn't find anything. And then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? Understand that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he will give you 2 days' worth of bread. Each of you stay where you are. No one is to leave his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. Here's the picture that I want you to have in your head. These people have been freed from slavery, okay? They've been freed from the fact that every day they were working, physically working for somebody else, just to survive. God delivered them. They're out in the wilderness. God says, you're supposed to keep the Sabbath holy. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And I will give you enough on that sixth day that you won't have to worry about the Sabbath. But still some refuse to follow that commandment. Probably because of lack of faith, maybe disobedience. Could it have been a little bit of laziness? Maybe they didn't want to work as hard on that sixth day, just pass off that extra work for the seventh day. What is it? Some people refused. And let's go to the New Testament here. Here's the point before we get into those verses. By the way, we're going to be in Matthew 11 to start with. The Sabbath, a day of rest, was God's design, rhythm, and commandment. It was a commandment in the Old Testament. But even before the commandment, we saw that God rested. It was God's design. It was His rhythm. He commanded His people to do it in Exodus. Now we're in the New Testament. But just kind of know, you have to know that before you get to the New Testament. You can't just start at the New Testament because then you'll have a incomplete theology of work and incomplete theology on rest. So Matthew 11, 28 to 30, here we start seeing Jesus talk about rest. We start seeing Jesus talk about those who would come to Him for rest. He says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened." How many of you feel like that? Do you feel like you're weary and burdened? There are definitely days where I feel weary and burdened. Maybe it's not days and days on end or months and months at a time, but there are just some days where I'm like, man, this day can't end fast enough. It's just been one of those days, and I'm weary and I'm burdened, and I just need rest. Jesus says to those who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. He says, take up my yoke and learn from me, because I'm lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. There's a good chance you've heard this before, that you've heard that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. What does that mean? Does that mean that God will take away the amount of work that we have to do? Does that mean that, is he actually talking about physical rest, that God will give us 8 hours of sleep every night if we just trust in him? Or is he talking about our souls? Is he talking about the rest for our souls? Because I can tell you there's times where I've been up late at night, either because of stress or something else that is just plaguing my body, and I'll just lay there. I think that happened in the last 2 weeks. For whatever reason, I kind of dozed off to sleep and woke up and had a couple things running through my mind, and I couldn't fall asleep at all afterwards. It was a rough day after that. I was in bed. I was there ready to sleep. I still needed Jesus to provide me with his yoke of being easy and the burden was light. So let's go to Mark chapter 2. We're going to keep building on this theology. Mark chapter 2, verses 27 to 28. And this section is where Jesus is starting to push the limits with the religious leaders. They took the commandment from the Old Testament. They actually added a lot of their own additional rules and guidelines, regulations to the Sabbath. And then Jesus started pushing their limits of what was allowed. And here's what he says. Then he told them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus is the one who created the Sabbath. And this is part of the problem. He's now beginning to lay some groundwork for the fact that I am the Messiah. You're following all these codes that Moses had and from the commandments and the things that you've added to it. Just the fact that he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, he's beginning to say, I am the Lord. And he says, the Son of Man is the Lord, even of the Sabbath. They didn't get along very well. Jesus didn't get along with these people very well because he kept pushing the limits of what they had in place, the religious laws that they had in place. And then he says he's the Son of Man. He's starting to make some claims that he is God. And then he's also the Lord of the Sabbath, that they claim that they have all the authority to say what the regulations are. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 7 through 9. He again specifies a certain day, today. He specified this speaking through David after such a long time. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. Therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. In the Ten Commandments, it's a good way to judge your life, judge if you're trying to be obedient to God's word. But those laws are things like, well, they started out with have no other gods before me. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then it also says that you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't murder. And Jesus repeats a lot of those, and he takes it actually a step further, I guess further illustrating that it's impossible for any of us to fulfill them all completely, perfectly. But the Sabbath was one he didn't repeat. But the principle is still there. And in Hebrews 4, we still see that therefore a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. So if we are good workers, we work hard, we 85% of us apparently say that we go above and beyond what we're supposed to do, how many of us are being faithful to a time of rest? Here's the picture that I have. We'll go back to the other screen. It's a pendulum. You can go one way or the other. You can swing one way and you become a workaholic, where you think that Sabbath isn't necessary, since it's not a command anymore, that you have the spiritual liberty to work all of your life. And you become a workaholic. And then you swing the other way, and you become like a legalistic Pharisee who says that, well, you have to keep the Sabbath the day of rest, and here's 101 rules of what you can't do on that day. Basically, the bare minimum, you can maybe eat, you can maybe drink, and sleep. That's it. You can't get up and leave your house. You can't talk to somebody else. You can become a legalistic Pharisee. Now, maybe we're not that far. I think that most of us probably lean towards that workaholic part of the pendulum, that we forget or we don't prioritize a time of rest. I can tell you that even from my own experience, when you look at athletes in particular, without rest, you won't perform at your capacity, your actual 100% ability. Growing up, I remember the very first time I preached, it was on John 15, and somehow I connected the dots of John 15, of being connected to the true vine and church attendance. And church attendance was preached to us as if there was never, ever any type of legitimate reason why you should miss. And I was ready to preach on that. I was preparing months ahead of time because that was my first time to preach. And my mom got a job at the hospital. My mom got a job at the hospital that sometimes required her to work on the weekends. I was struck with a decision. Was my mom's heart truly in a sinful behavior because she was supposed to take care of these sick people that if she wasn't there, they would die? But then that got me thinking, what about the police officer that has to work on a Sunday every once in a while? What about the firemen? What about the soldiers? Then my mind's just going crazy. I don't know what to think anymore. I just thought everyone was supposed to be off of work on a Sunday, otherwise they were living in sin. I was leaning towards that legalistic Pharisee. The balance would be a day of rest. That's what God has designed. That was God's rhythm in Genesis. That's what He still knows is what's best for us. And we should be doing that. Just like Hebrews 4 said, therefore, the Sabbath is still for God's people. We should be challenging ourselves to make sure that we have a day of rest. If a day comes up where you have to miss church, I understand. It should not be a regular thing. If it actually takes a spot in your life that you can never attend church, I would pray about that. Because the longer you go without gathering with God's people, I like to illustrate it like a couple logs on a fire. You separate those logs, they die out. They no longer have the flame, they no longer have the heat that they once had before because you separated them. So you need to gather with God's people. But if there's a day that comes up, we understand. Try to find that balance of rest in your daily lives, at least once a week. Find some time to rest. I'll pray for you, you pray for me. Actually, my former pastor, when I expressed to him my struggle with this and I'm tired and stuff, he's like, to be honest with you, I don't have a good answer. He's like, you're probably going to be tired for like 6 years until your kids get to be about 7 years old. I'm like, that does not sound very helpful. I'm very tired right now, and you're telling me I got more and more years of this. He's like, it's just a season. But my desire was there, and it still is, and sometimes we get that rest that we truly need. But let's not go to the extremes, okay? Let's not become so legalistic that we make it just like the Pharisees did, or obviously the rabbis at the time as well, that Jesus himself was saying, look, I'm going to heal some people on Sunday, okay? This is the work that I'm supposed to be doing, is about spreading the gospel and the message of basically salvation. Salvation is here, the kingdom is here. He's going to spread that message even on a Sabbath day. They're like, no, you can't be doing that. You can't be healing people on a Sunday. And he's like, well, I did. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. So let's not be like those rabbis, Pharisees, and be legalistic about it. But let's also not push ourselves to the point where we are workaholics and we push ourselves to burnout and stress levels that cause heart problems and even depression and those types of things. Let's work to find that balance of an in-between, which is where I feel like the biblical principle is that the Sabbath is still good. It's still something we should be working towards. So the question and kind of last thing that I have for you, the Sabbath was made for man. Jesus himself claims he's the master of the Sabbath, and he determines its use and regulations. Let's follow his example. Guess what? Jesus took naps. Jesus took time to get away from people. Jesus himself, because he was 100% man, 100% God, he had some physical limitations. He felt hunger, he felt weariness, he felt sadness, and he was tired at times, and he had to get away. Without that rest, he knew that he couldn't pursue basically the path he had to take, which is eventually led him to Calvary. And that's what we rest in, the fact that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, and we can go to him with our weariness and burdens. So as Christians, we have that privilege. If you're here and maybe you don't have a relationship with God, this is a benefit of salvation. It's that there is rest to be had today, and then ultimate joy and rest in heaven for eternity. So let's get ready to pray, and worship team, if you would come forward. And if this is an area you struggle with, like me, let's ask God to help us. Ask God to help us, even if it's, man, God, help me on Saturday. Make sure that I've got all my chores done so that I can rest on Sunday. It feels so good to have a clean house. It feels so good to have all your yard work done on a Saturday so that you can rest on Sunday. But it's also really easy just to say, well, I'll do that another day. Let's pray for God to help us with it, because it's best for us that we do take time to rest. Let's pray. God, this morning we look at this idea of rest and Sabbath, also in the picture of work. And God, I understand that for us, it's probably easier just to continue working and working hard every day. But help us follow your pattern. Help us follow the design that you put in place, which is to take some time to rest. It would be easy to take more weeks and preach about good work ethic and going above and beyond and doing and serving for other people. But the truth is, God, I don't see any way we can actually do that well without also being well rested. I think that's the full picture of work, is that we take time to rest in you, rest in the rest that you give us. And then for those 6 days, whatever days those are, God, we give it 100%. We give it our all. And then at the end of that 6th day, God, we're probably going to be tired because we gave it our all. But I just ask that you help us practice the full picture of work so that we can do better work for your kingdom. I praise to Jesus. Amen.